Okay, first up, whenever a lobbyist tells you he focuses on policy and not politics, it's good to have boots on. And Constance, thank you very much for a very sweet introduction. Karen, thank you for, patiently kind of coaching me through this. I'm always a bit intimidated when you've got this many smart folks in the room who are also, presenting, and then you're supposed to come up and respond. Dr. Mary, good to see you again. 16 years ago, Mary got sucked into the vortex of USDA politics and the Bush teams as Secretary Veneman had this twinkle in her eye about how to put together kind of a different approach as the Farm Bill was starting to ramp up and looking what is the state of agriculture and bringing some of the new pieces that, we kind of get lost in your typical Farm Bill debate. Where's the agriculture infrastructure? Those things that apply to, sanitary, phytosanitary rules, rural development, and so forth. And I promised Keith Coble this yesterday that I'd say he's the smartest guy in the room because he still has pictures, and I haven't quite figured out how to get him paid off yet. So, Keith, good to see you. And I enjoyed these opportunities because, first of all, you get to listen, like I said, to very smart folks to lay things out. Second thing, it brings to mind how all the careful analysis and sort of, as was mentioned, how agriculture trade, things Luis mentioned, is a business-to-business kind of enterprise, but it becomes tangled up in the politics of trade agreements. Over the years, I started on Capitol Hill with Senator Roberts, then Congressman Roberts, back in 1985. One of the things I learned early on is any trade agreement that comes up, it does not matter who the majority in Congress is, who the president is, you're going to work very diligently to get to 218 votes in the House, and then you're going to light a lot of candles and do a lot of praying to get to 60 votes in the Senate so that you can get to 51 to do that. And the odd part of it is it's not necessarily unique to the United States. A few years ago, when President Obama came in, the South Korean Free Trade Agreement was moving forward. And then Farm Bureau President Bob Stallman was visiting with the South Korean trade minister. And we got to talking to each other, waiting for that meeting to start. And he said, I worked for the minority when you were working for the Bush administration. I was working for the minority party in South Korea. And he said, it's kind of ironic, we got into the majority because we were so opposed to the Korean Free Trade Agreement. And he said, and our leadership at that time, the majority, lost their leadership because they were pushing this agreement that was such a quote-unquote bad deal. And he said, but I'm really curious as to how it went through your Congress so quickly. And I said, well, it's not any different here in the United States. I said, I can just picture John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, all of a sudden realizing, Nancy Pelosi's realizing I'm using George Bush talking points to tell John Boehner this is not a good deal, and vice versa. And it got to feeling really weird. And that's usually how you get a trade bill done or trade agreement done is folks go, this is just getting too weird. Let's get it done so we can go back to fighting over regular things. And that's what we were hoping for on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Unfortunately, that got pulled out from under us. And as we look at that, and when the previous panel was talking about farm income, by our analysis, American Farm Bureau, Dr. Bob Young, now this is not Dale's analysis, my background is animal science. So I know how to shovel it, I know how to, how to feed it, but I'm not real good at calculating the numbers. But Dr. Bob Young, who is the Deputy in Public Policy at Farm Bureau and also our Chief Economist, he and his team did some analysis on this. By our calculation, we left $4.4 billion in net farm income on the table when President Trump withdrew us from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, you kind of take a deep breath, okay, so where do we go next? Well, we're going to go to bilateral agreements, or bilateral trade negotiations. Now, again, the experience as a policy wonk and a lobbyist up on the Hill, and having been on the receiving end of the lobbying, and having been part of it at USDA in different times, it takes just as much work to get a bilateral agreement through Congress as a multilateral agreement. But the challenge is those negotiations have less bank shots that you can play off of to pull the country in. We recently had the opportunity to visit with some officials from Japan. And typically, those of you who've ever worked with Japan, you know how they can talk in nice, big, round circles, and when you're done, you feel really good. You're not quite sure. It's kind of like talking to guys like me. You're not quite sure what they said, but it sure sounded nice. What was different about this conversation was when we were asking, so Trans-Pacific Partnership, we had a great deal, access to Japan improving on beef, on pork, some great concessions on rice. And he was very blunt. He said, well, if the expectation is that we'll have a bilateral negotiation and we'll simply take those provisions out of TPP and plug them in for agriculture, that's not going to happen. Because Prime Minister Abe took a major political hit in the northern prefectures when he pushed TPP through the diet in his country. All of the farmers, all the livestock producers, those areas of Japan where agriculture is prevalent voted no. And they're going to vote no again when the election comes around, not too far from now. So he said, don't expect that that's just going to pick up where it left off. That kind of sends a chill down your back. The NAFTA part of the process. Again, it's challenging. We know, for example, with Canada, there are a few things we'd like to sort out on dairy, on wine, on other issues coming across. We know there are some with Mexico. But the approach that starts off with taking, certainly one of your largest trading partners and finding multiple ways to insult them before you start the negotiations does not seem like the best way to put the cards on the table. That is a tad bit frustrating to us in agriculture because of how important NAFTA is to us, how important CAFTA is, but trade agreements in general. And it's one of the things that the question, I think it's over here somewhere, somebody asked about, agriculture versus the other industries. And I know it sounds a little mercenary. I don't work for the other industries, but one of the constants that you will see in every trade negotiation, I know I'm getting off on a different angle here, Constance, but thank you. But when you look at the trade agreements, as they start going through, virtually everyone that I have been through the process and all the different places I've been in town, you will hear over and over and over again from those other sectors, I don't care whether it's manufacturing, financial, intellectual property, et cetera, that, well, we're ready to close this deal out, but agriculture is the problem. And about 15 minutes after agriculture announces, the white smoke comes out the chimney and it's like, hey, we've won. We've got an agreement. Everybody else all of a sudden goes, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not ready to go forward yet. And it's like, I remember asking this question one time 20-some years ago when NAFTA was going through, and I said, what's the deal? It's like, well, we never thought agriculture would ever come to an agreement. So we weren't really working on getting our agreements sorted out. So part of me feels like, that's the other industry's problem. If they're not going to come up to the table and be part of this and push these processes through, the politics of getting trade agreements done, of getting the impetus behind that moving forward, all the analysis that you really smart folks with the big slide rules can do isn't going to help us one bit because the politics are not going to play it out. Folks, even our members, don't understand sometimes. It's like, well, why are these trade agreements such a big deal? I say, well, it's worth $4.4 billion in net farm income. And then they look at me and it's like, okay, but what does that mean on, I'm from Kansas. So everything translates into cattle and, wheat. And I was like, well, Dale, how much does that mean? How many more cents a bushel am I going to get on my wheat? How much more, how many more dimes on 100 weighted cattle am I going to get because of this agreement? Well, you can't always break it down like that. One of the other things that I think we take for granted in this country, and it's kind of across the board, is what these negotiations mean in other countries. And it's one of these things, and Ambassador Darcy Vetter said it very well to a group of to my bosses at Farm Bureau one time. She said, there's some feeling that somehow we go into these trade negotiations just to capitulate. But they're negotiations, they're deals that we work out. Other countries are negotiating with us. It's not like they're just coming in so we can say, okay, here you sign on the dotted line. It's not like you click I agree on your iPhone. It's like, here, we're going to have this trade agreement. Do you agree or not? Go away. It's something that is a negotiation. And when you pull that together and you wonder, what is in it for these other countries? I recall the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. One of the things that fascinated me when got briefed, and we were sent out to kind of help sell this, both on the Hill and out in the countryside. And I remember explaining to a group of farmers and ranchers when they said, so why would Colombia agree to this? If we're getting all of these concessions on access to their markets, what's in it for them? I said, President Uribe has two neighbors, Venezuela and Ecuador. They're not the most democratically friendly countries in the world. And they said, well, he's just another, their comment was, is he just another conservative, the President Bush is linked up with? And I was like, well, I'm pretty sure President Uribe was running for president in the United States. He would definitely be a liberal Democrat in the process. It's not about that kind of politics. It's about President Uribe trying to get the United States linked in and help his economy so that he can build a democracy and improve and enhance the economy in his country. That's what they're getting out of this. And we need to appreciate what we bring to the table when we help countries, the developing countries. One of my favorite things I get to do each year is go over to Fort McNair and visit with the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. They have a class curriculum that they go through, and one of the things they bring in, folks are generally, captains, majors, some of them civilian rank, similar civilian rank within the Department of Defense. The first time I got to do this was, almost, I guess, 18, 19 years ago. And when I asked them kind of what the purpose was, they told me when they go out and as they were learning with all the conflicts going on around the world at that time, where we have men and women in harm's way, our military in harm's way, typically they're in countries, they're not in the developed countries, they're in the developing countries, or in some cases, countries that are pretty much piles of rubble. And the one economy that they virtually all have in common, and the one thing that ties them together is that A, they need to eat, and the one thing that they can start building without getting all the other infrastructure in place is an agricultural economy. And they can start building that up. And so the Department of Defense is putting their up and coming, I'm getting the pink card. All right, I'll start wrapping up. So when we start getting, what they were telling me is when you put, men and women in uniform who can help those local economies start building up their agricultural economy and not just get past the subsistence part, but get to the point where they've got something they can export. Those economic drivers, money starts flowing, economy starts flowing, then the desire to make things just a little calmer, a little smoother, a little more interactive come to play. So I'm not sure I added a whole lot to this other than share a few colorful anecdotes, but I will tell you something right up front, and I'm very candid, particularly with a group like this. If you ask me an easy question, I will give you a short answer. If not, I will prove to you I've been in Washington for 30 plus years. So, Constance. This always makes me nervous.
I can ask the first question, Dale, then. Curious, with a membership like the American Farm Bureau has, I'm curious if you saw a conflict between your members as agricultural producers and your members as rural residents. Because there seems to be a difference in the perspective of trade depending upon whether you have an off-farm job that's dependent on an industry that you feel is threatened by trade versus when you put your hat on as an agricultural producer who exports a significant part of the production. And I was wondering how Farm Bureau was kind of navigating that a bit, and please don't talk too long.
I say, were you not listening when I said easy questions, get short answers? Okay, two things. One, there is a bit of conflict, and it varies. Because, and I think back to Rudy's question on labor. We've got strong policy at Farm Bureau that supports a strong border security process. At the same time, we're very much in the mode, if we're not able to import our labor, we're gonna have to import more food. We've got states, California, for example, has shared with us, and I know others are doing it, where the farmers in those states are actually moving operations down to Mexico so that they have access to workers. The process getting them in is such a challenge now, but it is all tied up, in the immigration reform part of the process. Same thing happens on trade, and it's not necessarily even, you can have folks got cattlemen. One of our members, love him dearly. We're shirt-tail cousins. In his mind, he's not raising beef. He's raising, 5-weight stocker cattle that he's selling to the feedlot guys or somebody else to raise into the feeder range, and we have this argument every time I'm home. He'll say, well, what's in this for me? And it's like, well, here's what it's doing, for beef exports. And he'll say, I don't raise beef, I raise cattle. And so there's part of that that we have to figure out how we message it. It's like with consumers, well, if agriculture is working so hard to export all their food, what's in it for us? And to get back to, and this is something I'm stealing one of Chairman Roberts' lines that I've heard him repeat, for 30 plus years. If we're producing for, a robust, demanding export market, there's more than enough commodities, crops, livestock, you name it, being raised in this country to meet domestic demand. And that sometimes, again, even with an animal science degree, I can figure that out. If we can narrow ourselves down to where we're just focused on domestic, or if we expect trade agreements to simply let us export everything we want but nothing can come in, that's kind of a short-lived proposition.
Other questions?
My fellow Kansan back there, Mr. Dowd, how are you doing?
Greg?
You don't want to ask a question because I'll come to the next meeting and ask him a question.
We're very pleased to have our roundtable friends here. Ag Roundtable. If you don't know about them, Betsy Faga, make sure to get in contact with her.
Mary.
What would you like ag economists to work, if you had, say, your top 2 things we could work on that would be informative to people making good decisions about trade, what would they be?
Well, actually, I was going to put, why heritage is wrong at the top of my list, but we'll set that off to the side for right now. On the trade front, I think part of what is so critical is helping folks understand, that sort of, and I think the way you laid it out, what is that sort of matrix that is part of trade? There's an assumption, I think when the border adjustment tax, for example, came in, have folks saying, well, this ought to be good. We're going to get a tax break on everything we export. And it's like, yeah, but, if I'm a farmer or rancher and, pick a company X that's exporting, are they going to pass that tax break back to me in form of higher prices? History would say probably not. Now, if they have to pay more in taxes for something they import that I need to buy from them, are they going to charge me more for that product? History would suggest yes, they are. So those are kind of oversimplistic kind of questions, but the details on how something like a border adjustment tax or a value-added tax, or step it back even farther, what are the kind of the fundamentals? If I am importing coffee, we look at it as like, well, coffee's kind of a no-brainer because everybody wants more coffee. But I've got members in Hawaii, and I've got members in Puerto Rico that are saying, we make coffee, so we want that 100%. I mean, this is how we want that 100% that was up there imported coffee. Maybe it ought to be 99, imported, and the rest of it coming from us. And they have challenges in terms of that. So kind of meandering around the barn here, but it's those kinds of things that can connect the dots so that, if I'm talking to, my cousins out west of Dodge City and they're wanting to know what's in this for me, and it's like, well, I raised a lot of, corn, and according to your, Dale, according to Farm Bureau's analysis, corn exports are going to go down. And I said, yeah, but you're also raising cattle. And that corn that you're raising is going to get fed to them here, so you don't have to ship it to Japan, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things that sort of the practical that can be broken down into what does this mean to, that man or woman with their boots in the dirt, as opposed to what it may mean, in the big macro sense.
Great. Other questions? And I love all the animal references. We're multidisciplinary here. We want to engage other disciplines, so definitely appreciative of that.
Yeah, when I get nervous, I go to cowboy mode, just kind of. Anybody want to volunteer to help build fence out in Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, or Texas? I can give you a great vacation. So just, there you go.
My name is Elizabeth Stolberg. I'm with Agronomy, Crop, and Soil Sciences. I've heard a lot, I love agricultural economists. I love them. I'm not one, but I love
I feel a butt coming. Go ahead.
I hear a lot about, this is what we researched, this is what we studied, this is what we learned. And rarely do I hear, but this is what we still need to do. I heard a little bit from the panel earlier. We need to connect things, right? We need to make sure we understand how trade policies actually affect people. And from you as well, talking about, how does everything we do affect people on the local level? Would you say that those are the priorities for agricultural economic research? The local level, the connecting things, and what other, top level priorities do you think there are?
Well, it's a challenge. I would say, yes, we need the local level impacts because selfishly, that helps me develop talking points when I'm trying to, knock on doors, influence hearts and minds. But you need the macro level too, because it's like, okay, so I've raised the price of wheat a nickel, but, I can flip it a dime just because Mother Nature had a conniption fit, this morning. So what does that really mean in the overall part of it? I think, for example, one of the last things our board does at our annual meeting, our convention, is set the priorities for the year. And this year we've got reg reform, the Farm Bill, tax reform, immigration reform, and I always forget one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Trade. Bing. Please don't tell Juliana or Mr. Duval I did that. So we're talking about trade today. That's one of the things that, when we look at that, so what do we need, in that kind of context? Now, we're one group, and you go around the table, and, most groups kind of have a sort of the same number of lists, but what do we need it for, I think becomes part of it. And something that I know my former USDA colleagues very familiar with is, you're putting a budget together, and typically if I'm putting a USDA budget together, about now I'm thinking about going behind the curtain for the FY19 budget. So Mary's got to put her budget together, and here's what she's going to need and the resources she needs for research, et cetera. And then you got guys like me that come in, it's like, hey, next week the Ag Committee's going to do X, and I need a report on this. Doesn't have to be more than 20 pages, And it's like, I can just pull it out, and this is the other part, I want it to show this. So then as a researcher, as an analyst, it's like, well, but I'm not sure the data's going to show that. It's like, well, I'm sure you can make it show that. This is what I want. See? So I say that kind of lightheartedly, but that's part of the challenge, because in the work, I don't care whether it's at USDA or at the land grant or the college level, the institution level, or even in the private sector, you've got to have some sort of input from folks like me that is more than, I need it in a couple of weeks. Because it's not like you can just if you could just pull open the drawer and pull out the report, then we already know the answer. It's kind of coming up with these combination of questions. So part of that is, again, like in our shop, we have 4 economists on the team, and about half our conversations, start with, okay, Dale, let me explain the real world to you and how long it's going to take to pull the data set together just so we can start crunching the numbers. See how I evaded your question all the way around, but there you go. Other questions?
We have time for one more.
You're good at this, Karen. I like it. It's like, I'm standing between you all and lunch.
You actually are.
I knew that. I recognize, okay, if we can get him to shut up, we'll get to go eat.
But we're delighted to have you do that.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity to visit.